Hello, and welcome to Parallel Discussion 2C, Why Do Scientists Engage the Public in Science? My name is Adam Fagen. I'm the Director of Communications, Advocacy, and Member Engagement at the Association of Science and Technology Centers, which is the membership association for science centers and museums and other organizations committed to engaging the public in science and technology. Today's session will focus on scientists' motivation to do public engagement and the factors that influence their motivations, including the interplay between individual motivation and creating inclusive spaces to engage the public. We will kick off this session with a presentation from Nicole Bennett, then proceed to a panel featuring Paige Giroud, Todd Newman, and Mohamed Noor. Just a reminder that we encourage your questions and participation during the session. Please use the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen to enter any questions for the speakers. We will monitor all questions and will get to as many as we have time for. And of course, feel free to continue to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves. So first off, Nicole Bennett, who researches inclusive science communication in the PhD program at the Stan Richards School of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Texas. Their work is at the intersection of science communication, applied theater, and social justice. Before this, they researched climate change conservation biology while earning a master's in ecology, evolution, and behavior from the University of Texas. They are also an improv performer, director, and technical designer, and have won 3 B. Iden Payne Awards and an Austin Chronicle Critics Table Award. We'll welcome Nicole and take it away.
Thank you so much, Adam, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to get to kick off this session. And here we are. Let's get the presentation started. So we're going to be talking about why do scientists engage the public in basic science. So just to if you're like me and you really like an agenda at the top, here you are. I'm most excited for our panel discussion where we'll get to hear perspectives from all different walks of life and experiences. So what my job here is going to be to set up that conversation. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the scholarship in strategic science communication, especially that coming out of my collaborators' research labs. And then we're going to complicate that, extend it, resist it, problematize it by talking about the research in inclusive science communication. And we'll dive into an example or two from my own work that can show some of the approaches that we're taking there. So that's the plan. I don't really ever have to convince anybody in these talks, but just to get us started, it's important that scientists communicate. There's been calls from institutional directors, scientific leaders for scientists to get out there and talk to people, whether that is to defend against misinformation online or to share about their science with policymakers. And the good news is the survey data shows us that scientists are not only taking up this call, but they are enthusiastically taking up this call. It's something that they value. It's something that's really important to them. And we know a lot about the factors that go into whether a particular scientist is going to be more or less willing to do this. What are some of the psychological factors that underlie that? So we know a lot about quantity, but today I'm actually going to focus on quality. And when we think about quality of communication, we often think about how effective are we being at science communication? And one kind of angle to think about this is how strategic are scientists in their communication? So by strategic, my research group thinks about strategy as a series of intentional choices. So in an ideal world, we would pick our goals first. These are our long-term, what we would like to happen as a result of all the time and energy and love and sweat that we put into science communication. What long-term would we like to happen? Is that informing policy with science? Is that inspiring the next generation of young STEM leaders? So these kind of long-term goals that we hope that our communication will help affect. And so along the way to those goals, we might have shorter term objectives, this kind of middle purple arrow. And those are ways that we can reach those goals. I'll dive in a bit more to objectives in a bit. And then there are tactics. This is always the one that's most, is easiest for me to grasp because they're so concrete. And this is often where the focus lies in a lot of training programs. These are the tools and techniques and activities we do. This is whether you love social media in your science communication, or whether you love having conversations with young people about what it's like to be a scientist. These are the actual things you do, the tactics. And while there's a lot of great work on goals and tactics, and Todd just came, who's on our panel, actually just came out with a research note recently on looking into some of the tactics that scientists use. I'm actually going to focus today on objectives because it helps us answer that question of how strategic scientists are being. So when we ask scientists, what objectives do you prioritize, or would you be willing to prioritize in your science communication? We think of these in two categories when we're thinking about strategic science communication. So above this thin line, we have informing about science and defending science from misinformation. And we think of these as kind of the traditional categories of education-based. Sometimes these can be very one-way transmission, kind of making sure to share knowledge about science or to defend the knowledge of science. And these tend to be more traditional. Below the line, we are what we would call more strategic science communication objectives. And we call them more strategic because there's not a lot of, if your goal is to change attitudes and behaviors, to change hearts and minds, just sharing knowledge is often not associated with that. So if your long-term goal is to change hearts and minds, these first two objectives are maybe not going to be the most effective. Those below this line, exciting about science, building trust in science, tailoring messages about science, are more likely to affect emotions, affect how someone feels about you as a scientist or about science in general. And these are more strategic when your long-term goal is changing attitudes or behaviors. So unfortunately, when we do these surveys, we do see that these more traditional objectives are more prioritized by scientists, informing about science and defending science against misinformation. And so kind of an answer to our question, how strategic are scientists being in their communication? The answer is not very, but this is definitely not an answer of blame. If we think about the ways in which scientists are often trained in communication, if at all, we rarely are trained in communicating. And if we are, it is often preparing us to be lecturers in front of classrooms, to literally share knowledge. So it's really not surprising that sharing information is most often associated with an objective for science communication. So not a surprise and not a blame that should fall on any individual scientist. Maybe this is a helpful wake-up call to those of us who are more in the infrastructure. So perhaps there's a role for science communication trainers to help guide scientists in this strategy of mapping out their goals, objectives, and tactics. So this next chart is quite busy, but it's just kind of thinking about this menu that is available to us. So the main take home from all of this is it would be really useful and would make our science communication more effective if we were to diversify our objectives beyond just sharing knowledge. There's of course no one-size-fits-all solution, which is why this chart kind of grows and grows as we keep talking to people. But being really intentional, picking a goal that matters to you, to your audience, to your context, matches your values, then picking an objective that would get you to that goal. If you're hoping to change hearts and minds, thinking about one of those more strategic science communication objectives, and picking tactics that match that. And this is a continuing body of research. We're still trying to kind of name what this menu looks like. My advisor, Anthony Dudo, often brings up a great metaphor of, if all we're doing with science communication is just sharing information, it's kind of always going and eating from the hot dog stand. You're always getting a hot dog. You might get different toppings on it, but it's still always a hot dog. And what he would rather we do is think about it more like a buffet, where you can choose the meal, the objectives that are going to get you to that final goal. So that is the state of strategic science communication. And now I'm going to kind of extend and complicate that, thinking about, where does inclusive science communication research fall in this? So although thinking about science communication in strategic ways is still super important, and I can see how it matches with intentionality, and I definitely see my work kind of deriving from that, it's also very, very necessary to take a step back and be critical and reflective about the goals we're choosing in the first place. So much of this work focuses on the individual scientists or on kind of an aggregate look of scientists. And it's really also important that we be critical and reflective about who is being included and who is being excluded from these efforts, both on the scientist side and on their collaborators and audience. The concept of the circle of human concern is often a useful theory I use here. It comes from John Powell's work at UC Berkeley. And it's this idea of really critically reflecting about who your work is benefiting. And the science communications efforts tend to benefit privileged and dominant people. So if we go back to thinking about the objectives, if we are mostly sharing information and informing, we're often just talking to audiences that are already really excited about science, already really know a lot about science. So we end up preaching to the choir. And inclusive science communication also asks us to think about the fact that we might be preaching to a choir also is quite a privileged group. So it's really important to think about who belongs. There's been some great work in the past year by Catherine Canfield and Susan Menez on landscaping interviews with leaders in the inclusive science communication world. And so they did all of these interviews with these great folks, and then they found 3 traits: intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity, that are all traits that occur in overlapping ways when inclusive science communication is being done effectively. So these are really helpful guidelines for thinking about these goals, objectives, and tactics in a really critical way, and thinking about who is in that circle of human belonging. So I'm going to dive into 2 examples, one that's been completed and is hopefully going out to journals soon, and then one that is super in progress. So you'll kind of get a vision of the future of some of my dissertation work. So to think about the ways in which we might be preaching to the choir, that if we just keep on doing business as usual in science communication, we might just be reproducing social inequities. So by doing nothing, we end up being complicit. So for one example of this, I did interviews with science communication fellowship staff using a framework from Emily Dawson, who's done a lot of amazing work on UK science centers. And she looks at these UK science centers and thinking more deeply than just broadening participation. Sometimes we think about diversity in really shallow ways. We think about, oh, if we could just get more people of different intersectional identities inside the door, then I will have succeeded. But she asked us to think more deeply about this, borrowing from some theories of social reproduction and thinking about infrastructure, literacy, and community acceptance. So infrastructure is the extent to which people can access the institution. So what are the costs to getting there? Literacy is once you're in the door, can you even use the resources? And community acceptance is the extent to which we are introspective about these things. So I don't have time to go in detail about each one of these things, but I'll pick this first one from literacy. Thinking about these science communication fellowship programs are really, really amazing things to be a part of. You get to have experience in context for a year, doing the type of science communication you want to do, but they often require prior science communication experience. And it would be really useful for us to deeply name what counts as prior experience. So look out for a paper coming out on this, as well as some of the other aspects of science communication fellowship programs, thinking about this kind of at the institutional level of whether these programs are gatekeeping or not. Switching over to the individual level and kind of giving you a sneak preview of what my dissertation work is going to be. My body of work is really interested, actually more at the individual level, with thinking about when and how can science communication be something we call healing-centered engagement. So healing-centered engagement is an asset-based expansion of what is known as trauma-informed care. In other words, what are some of the ways in which participating in science communication allows us as scientists, and I'm especially interested in graduate students, when does it allow us to kind of step back into our full selves? So anecdotally, I've talked to graduate students in STEM, and they've talked about how science communication has reminded them of why they love doing science. It allows them to be creative. It allows them to kind of step back into these parts of themselves of joy and resilience that academia and the disconnection of those structures had kind of divorced them from. And so there's a theory of change that Grace Lee Boggs says better than I can, that maybe this is a way to create these bubbles of joy and resilience that we could transform ourselves to transform the world. And the next steps in this are that I'm currently doing with STEM graduate students about how they make meaning of science communication activities and their sense of belonging in these spaces. And I'll be really excited, probably the next time I talk, we'll be talking about that. But with that, let's get to the really exciting part of this. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for really grounding us in all these issues and really helping frame the discussion that we're going to have. Next, we're going to turn to our panel, who I'll introduce in a moment. And just another reminder that if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of our speakers, please use the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. So we have three panelists. Paige Giroud is a biomedical scientist turned storyteller. She earned a PhD in mass communication, and after a short stint in a biomedical engineering program, in her research, she studies the role of scientists as communicators and the impacts of SciCon and new media. She's currently the Vice President of Science Communication at LifeOmic, and she co-founded LifeOlogy, a platform that brings science and art, scientists and artists together to make science and health information more accessible. Next, we'll have Todd Newman, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Life Science Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an affiliate of the Robert F. and Jean E. Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Todd's research focuses on the role of strategic communication within the context of science, technology, and the environment. He's the editor of Theory and Best Practices in Science Communication Training, as well as the co-author of Brand. He received his PhD in communication from American University and previously served as a postdoctoral research associate at the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. And finally, we have Mohamed Noor, who's professor of biology and dean of natural sciences at Duke University, where he conducts research in the broader areas of genetics and evolution, with special interest in genetic recombination, the genetic changes that cause new species to form, and a molecular evolutionary process that operate within species. While always engaged in some outreach, he has started to leverage his love of Star Trek and other science fiction to teach real-world science concepts to the public via talks at conventions, and YouTube videos, and college courses, and in a book he wrote called Live Long and Evolve, What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life on Other Worlds. And he has also recently been contracted by CBS Paramount as a science consultant for the television series Star Trek Discovery. So with that, I will let the panelists take it away, starting with Paige.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Nicole, for that awesome talk. I'm just gonna add some color from my background, and hopefully we'll have good discussion after this. So I've also done some research on why scientists engage the public and new media, especially in the blogging world, is kind of where I've done some research and focus. And it's really interesting to me because I started out my science communication through blogging, and what motivated me to do that, what I think motivates a lot of scientists to start to engage the public, is kind of maybe opinions that the public doesn't really know their area of science. For me, I did nanotechnology research and just thinking, there's not enough people that know about this or aware of this. A lot of scientists might start engaging with the public to address myths or even do myth busting. So the original, like the blogging world, the science blogging world came from in terms of dispelling myths and kind of countering misinformation. So it's a lot of kind of external goals that I think motivate a lot of scientists to start to engage the public, to increase knowledge, to increase support for science, to educate. But what's interesting to me is that in talking to a lot of scientist bloggers, while they might start with those goals, what ends up sustaining their writing over time are more internal goals. The improving their own writing skills and writing about science and finding that it changes, it improves their own understanding of it. They start to see it in different ways. They're exploring like self-expression and even joy in doing science communication. And so, it's interesting that there's this balance between internal and external goals where with a lot of scientists, when they start to engage the public, what really I think underlying what's motivating them to continue are these internal goals. That I think personally, if they listen to more and if they follow, what makes me excited, what do I love talking about, sometimes that connects with people more than if they just focus only on those external goals. And what's interesting also is that, in my kind of life after studying blogging, I started to explore how scientists might collaborate with artists, what might motivate them to do that, and what might be some things that result from those collaborations. And in that, there's an interesting dynamic of collaborating with artists and creators who have very internal goals in terms of why they create art and how they approach creating art. And I think some of those collaborations with artists turn into kind of really exploring kind of self-expression and our own exploration of what we did, how different ways of viewing our own science that ends up probably, benefiting a lot of scientists more themselves than even, than they thought, and might be a way for them to explore and humanize their science in a way that's positive, as opposed to just focusing only on educating or kind of teaching people what they think they should know. So I think it's, maybe in this panel discussion, we'll explore a little bit about the difference between those internal and external goals, and then also the value of starting to collaborate with people that are very different from you. Scientists collaborating with artists, they also might explore and find that they communicate about their science and learn new things about their science than they thought they were going to. And in seeking kind of deeper meanings of their own science and finding joy in it, that's also a way to connect with the public, perhaps, more closely than if you were just trying to kind of speak at the public. So yeah, I'll stop there and we can have some more discussion.
Thanks so much. Next, we'll go to Todd.
Great. Well, thanks, Nicole, for that great overview. And we've worked on a number of projects together, so I'll build off of that to some extent. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is, I think the point you're making about inclusive SciComm and the need for more community-centered research, because I think that's something that's coming up a lot in the research we're doing and thinking about how to collaborate with community partners, nonprofits, other organizations, for example, those based in Wisconsin and Madison, and thinking about groups who aren't traditionally in in the samples that we're looking at, and doing that in a way that involves them in the research process from the beginning. And my colleagues and I have been starting to look at some of those opportunities, for example, with misinformation with Black American communities, and seeing and really getting an understanding of their perceptions of it. So I think, that's something that I think health communication has done a really good job with, that I think science communication can also think about in a strategic way about what those connections are. The second thing is, I like what you present on the objectives for science communication, and how often with the scientist surveys that we've done a number of, informing this deficit model always comes up as the most important objective. And consistently in the last several surveys we looked at too, the one objective that comes close to the bottom or near the bottom is hearing what others think, which goes against a lot of what I think the discussions of engagement, especially two-way engagement, are that we're grappling with in this conference. And then the final point I want to make too is just about, thinking of strategic communication, right? It's knowing who your audience is, which I think, a lot of science communication research and science communication practitioners try to understand. And, we have a good idea to some extent about that. And we've been grappling with the differences between, basic versus applied. Is there a distinction there? But there are very different meanings that the public has when you say science. And there was a discussion earlier, what does science even mean? Science means many different things. But scientists, and we've done work on this, trying to gauge, well, how does the public think and feel about science, and how do scientists think and feel about science? And echoing some of the points Paige was just making, scientists, the majority of them think of science in terms of joy and excitement, right? That's what gets them motivated. The public, we find overwhelmingly, 60%, some around that, thinks in terms of hope. They think in terms of application. What does it mean for me? So there's a disconnect there. Are you trying to get the public to better connect to how you, the scientists, see it, or how the scientists should connect to the public? And I think the point to iterate again is this is two-way engagement, right? It's understanding, how to think about engaging with the public, and thinking about attitudes, opinions, behaviors, etc., but also changing the scientists and the science they do themselves. So I'll leave my points there, and look forward to more conversations.
Thank you so much, Todd. Mohamed.
So I'm probably the least qualified person on the panel, in that I've had no formal training in communication. I'm not in the communication department, but I think my lack of qualification is extraordinarily common among scientists more generally. And this is especially true even among ones who are engaging with the public on science, right? We have all these people who have, biology, chemistry, whatever PhDs, and they've never had any training. They're just going out there and they muddle forward, which is, the way I've started doing it as well. Fortunately, I've tried to correct that since then. But I really liked how Nichole elegantly described those different levels of how strategic scientists are. And I wanted to amplify and build on one of their points and its root. I think a lot of untrained scientists assume that these long-term goals of appreciation of science, especially basic science, and informing on science just naturally follow from the super short-term goals around activities. Oh, we'll do this activity and then they'll love science. Really? And I think they're often not so intentional about those long-term goals, aside from maybe a couple of quick sentences in a presentation. And two common errors that I very often see scientists make are treating public communication like either a research seminar or an introductory course lecture. So this sort of goes with what Paige said about speaking at the public, and also, as Todd was talking about, the two-way aspects of it. There's often fairly little regard for what does the audience know, where are they coming from. And this is a very, very common problem among people who are untrained, but very common across people who are speaking to the public. Now, what I love about what Nichole said at the beginning about the inclusive science community is that it's a contrast to the quote-unquote weed out mentality that used to be really common in science, but I feel like it's fading now, but it's still around in some academic areas. This idea of that I got into science by hearing about or doing cutting edge research, or I got into science or I did really well in college after having done X or Y. I mean, it's not considering the diversity of people that are out there. And specifically those who don't have as much privilege as many of us did. Now, if we keep doing that, then we can't expect greater inclusion. So I really appreciated those comments. But I think we're already at 4:40, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here and move to the broader discussion.
Thanks all for such reactions. Before we turn to questions, I just wanted to give a little bit of an open space if any of our speakers want to riff on what anybody else was saying that you haven't already done. All right. Feel free to chime in as we go. So several of you commented really about that sort of interplay between sort of internal goals and external goals. I'd welcome you all to sort of unpack that a little bit more, and particularly thinking about how to make those sort of not so distinct, but ways to have the motivations for this serve both internal and external purposes.
I can start, I guess, as I brought this up. So, I mean, I think, you know, one thing that has made me think about this recently is a collaboration with an artist and a science communicator, Alice Fleerackers, has been doing some research around this area and just exploring, kind of looking at science artists' motivations, because there's not a lot of research on that. And I think what's really interesting is that their motivations often kind of don't necessarily align. Like science, you know, people creating art about scientists don't necessarily creating art about science. Their motivations aren't aligning with typical science communication goals that are kind of very externally focused, of educate the public or make people appreciate science and that kind of thing. And while I think, you know, it's good to be strategic about what we want perhaps for science communication to do, sometimes we only start from like what, you know, only thinking about ourselves as scientists, what we want to happen. And it's not very inclusive or, you know, welcoming of what other people really want to know about science. It's kind of very top down. And so I think it's interesting to start thinking about the internal goals as a way for like self-expression and joy and the kind of things that maybe the public would see in science, or, you know, what we think science can do for ourselves or for others. I think starting there can maybe help us to connect with the human elements in our science that then help us better connect with the public. So it's almost like exploring those, you know, very human elements of why we do what we do in order to realize that, that there's personal connections for everyone with science, and we can't forget those when we're trying to communicate with the public.
So one thought that came to my mind when from the question is, this ties in with what Nicole said earlier on about the role of graduate students in outreach. I mean, graduate students are phenomenal, at least the ones I see. They're phenomenal at their outreach, and I think they're very internally motivated because there aren't that many external things for the grad students to do it. So when they're launching it, they're going in because they're passionate about it. Maybe they had some good experiences, or they had some bad experiences they want to correct for others. I love that. We don't. I mean, it's true among some faculty as well. At least in the. I mean, I'm talking about the natural sciences, not people who are in communication specifically. It's true, but I think what's happened there is just, there's this pressure all the time, like, oh my gosh, you know, you have to produce more of your research. And given there seems to be not just a lack of incentive, but like almost a devaluing of a lot of outreach, that makes it really hard for faculty to engage more in it, because even if they're passionate about it, they're like, I could do this thing, but it's literally just coming out of like my family time. It's not coming at all out of my job time. So I think that's a big barrier. And it's something that, you know, academic institutions can work actively to try to correct. It's just, you know, put more. It's a little bit conflating the intrinsic and extrinsic, but I think by having a little bit of extrinsic, but not too much, you can actually allow the intrinsic aspects space to grow.
Yeah, and I would just add too, I mean, I completely echo those comments, Mohamed, with, you know, the external factors that lead to supporting this. And, you know, I think those who are in institutions and departments, I mean, you can look at it through the hierarchies as you want to, that have that that support that culture, means a lot. But the incentive structure, right, for especially for a lot of tenure track, is not necessarily built into that. But I think adding into the internal motivation, I mean, you know, from a lot of the surveys that I've done with Nichole and John Besley and Anthony Dudo and others, right? I mean, the self-advocacy is a very important factor in what gets what you know, the motivation for scientists to engage. And self-advocacy, right, is something that, I mean, some of us are skilled at being natural, being communicators, just being good at communicating. The majority of us, right? I mean, for a lot of scientists, they go into science because they don't want to necessarily communicate with everyone. But the thing that I think is important to recognize with that is that communication is a skill. It's a muscle. It gets built. You need to practice. You need to engage. And I think, building in the training aspect to this, and whether it's the graduate, the fellowships, especially with graduate students and the approaches they're taking, but even some of the other kind of informal lifelong learning education opportunities. I mean, you have to practice, just like anything else. I mean, it is like that. And to say, sure, there's some people that probably shouldn't be communicating, but for the majority, it is something you can work at and you can build. And I think that key variable of self-efficacy, that's something that can be built and that can be changed through motivation is I think really important to recognize, and the strength that has in motivating scientists and other experts to engage. So yeah.
I love that comment. Add to the not just practice, but also have true assessment. Not just you did it, but like you did it, and you actually did true assessment, not just your one buddy who went with you said that was good.
Yeah, exactly. Which in and of itself is a complicated thing too. I mean, we can have a whole discussion on evaluation too, but.
Nicole, I saw you nodding furiously. I think you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think Todd is bringing up a lot of the points I'm thinking about too. Just the great body of research on intrinsic versus extrinsic, and that it is kind of a spectrum. You can be a little bit of both, and there are certain good middle grounds for certain things. There's a lot of research on paying people to do more mindless work is somewhat helpful, but with something like science communication, actually extrinsic rewards may be useful in the short term, but long term is not necessarily, like Paige was saying, it's not a super sustainable way to keep you coming back to writing a science blog that is gonna take your time and energy. And so just kind of thinking also about like, if we are wanting to, especially, and connecting back to what Todd is saying about community engagement, which is a super relational task. It's getting very trendy to do that. And those of us who have built like Paige has done, built relationships with communities, that time. So this kind of intrinsic motivation is also helpful in that sustainable way and kind of connecting all these things.
Thank you. So next question is really talking about the ways to help break down the barriers between those who are sort of formally trained in science, academic route and all of that kind of stuff, and others who are involved in the conversation. And I would expand this to say, Todd, you were sort of talking about community-centered research and working on problems that people actually care about, understand the the value about why somebody do that. So are there ways to kind of break down those barriers or help encourage, I would say particularly the scientific community, to be more inclusive and engaging a wider audience, not just when I'm sharing results, but really as part of the planning process, and make the broader community feel like they are a part of science, even if that's not their day job?
I mean, I think just response to that, a lot of it is just changing the face of science. I mean, a lot of the times when, I talk to community members or I talk to groups who are doing outreach and engagement about trying to understand more about, how different communities think and feel about different scientific issues, it's bringing in a scientist or another expert that looks like them or that comes from a similar community. And the trust is just built there, right? It's, the saying in strategic communication, it's the messenger sometimes that matters more than the message. So I think that's a big part of it. But I guess I echo a lot of. I mean, it's work to build these collaborations and finding collaborators that you can do this with, and I think also really understanding. internally from myself, how these processes of working with community partners and bringing perspectives of these audience into the initial design of the actual research that we're doing is super important, and is something that is that collaborative effort, and to the same extent, how is the output going to benefit them, and I think that's been something I've been trying to understand and trying to work with others to do better at, especially when it comes to science communication research. And especially with what's happened in the last year and a half, with just kind of misinformation and understanding the antecedents of that, et cetera. But yeah, I think others might have better perspectives as well.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, one contrast I see between engineering and a lot of the rest of the natural sciences is engineering is very good at identifying like a problem and then going at it. Like, and it's a problem that already exists, whereas natural scientists like myself, we just like to sit there and just think like, oh, I'm really interested in this problem and I want to do that. And we're not as engaged in terms of trying to figure out what do people care about outside of our scientific community. And that's something that I think could be worked into our actual research training. Because I think, why not? Why not have things that people care about be like, and I'm not saying that everything has to be purely applied science. It could still be basic science, but things that connect in some way for at least a fraction of our effort, that would make a huge difference in terms of the public perception of science. So just a thought.
Yeah, and I had a thought just in terms of like, I think, we had asked a question like, how could we help people who aren't necessarily trained in science communication start engaging in it better. So from the very beginning of my SciComm career, I've been a huge proponent of like social media as sort of this potentially democratizing platform where anyone without training can get science communication practice. And I still am a proponent of that, of scientists like just starting and blogging and creating content, and you'll learn a lot through that to become a better science communicator. But lately I'm kind of moving a little bit more towards like, before yes, that's great. But mostly on social media, you're still going to be talking to other scientists. Like you tend to get in these echo chambers. And lately I'm a big proponent of instead starting with collaboration, like go to someone who, an artist, someone who like for a living creates, storybook, kids book authors, like people that tell stories and create content that touches people's heart for a living, and learn from them like in collaboration. And even if you don't have formal training, I think that's invaluable as those collaborative efforts.
Just to add another perspective and another question about sort of going back to the public and that sort of balance, because of course you want the public to buy in, but the scientists need to buy in too. And they have motivations for doing this, a greater depth of understanding. How does one strike the balance? Not making it a completely democratic process, but really engaging that wider community in a discussion about what priorities are.
Might be able to add on to some of the thoughts before and possibly dovetail us into that, but I'll also offer everyone. My favorite type of research is called participatory action research, and it is essentially choosing a goal that both the scientists and the community agree that is important for everyone, and kind of doing activist work, but researching the process. So for example, there's a group in Austin called Austin Youth River Watch, and it's a bunch of young people who restorative ecology. And so I've been working with them about what are the counter stories to, we've been told all these things, all these ways we're supposed to protect the environment, straws, we're supposed to reuse, recycle, but kind of going deeper in those and looking really into what we call cultural community wealth, where what's already out there, what's already free, what do we already have, what's culturally related to us, what do we care about? And these are young people in high school, collaborating with scientists who already have environmental justice as a goal, and then letting the young people kind of lead what stories we follow. So I guess like the how how we do our research also super matters.
Well, this is a great discussion. I'm sorry we have to cut it short, but we are at time. So please encourage everybody to continue the discussion throughout the conference. There's the connection lounges for drop-in conversations, and also bring your ideas, your questions, and your vision for the future to one of the brainstorming sessions tomorrow. Thank you all for a great panel and a great discussion about this. And we look forward to continuing this through the conference and beyond. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.